and since this is your first time speaking in the chamber, you're entitled to what are called maiden's rights. Okay. You do not actually have maiden's rights.
I don't actually have maiden's rights, no. It's not my first time. Hello everyone. I am here today to oppose this motion that you have nothing to fear if you have nothing to hide. I'm going to start with a short anecdote to convey how this invasion of privacy that can occur through modern technology is such a huge issue. For example, just before one of my first lectures, I was sitting down, just looking around the theatre, and of course there seemed to be a laptop out in front of everyone on their desks, so they could take notes, or at least pretend to. But I noticed that the vast majority of people in the theatre had a little piece of paper stuck over their laptop camera. Sure, I know all about the horror stories of people being spied upon through their webcams, but actually seeing people covering their laptop cameras made me realise that the taking of personal information actually is a serious, legitimate concern in our age of modern technology. It is especially important because while it's true that hackers can access our information and see what we're doing in our private lives, we often unknowingly hand over private information online. Thus, our privacy can be invaded in ways that it has never been invaded before. In this speech, I will address one huge point as to why our privacy is essential, regardless of whether or not we are hiding something. It's important because information obtained about us can be abused in numerous ways. We don't know where our information goes sometimes after it has been accessed by some of these big companies and what they do with it. Sarah has already mentioned how our information on social media accounts is often used to tailor advertisements. And this is certainly true. We upload photos onto Facebook, we like the pages, various pages of things we're interested in, and of course we stay in touch with family and friends. On a much creepier level altogether, however, Facebook also collects information about what other sites we visit. For example, if you go onto Google and search for a particular item, and then go onto Amazon and buy that item, when you next go on Facebook, you'll see advertisements from Amazon for whatever you were looking for or for something similar. Sure, it's a handy business strategy as it means that ads can be targeted accurately. However, I think most people will agree with me when I say it's also incredibly unnerving that a social media site, just a second, can access what we do on the internet, even if it's not on that website itself. Yeah.
So you're not saying that people don't have the capacity to make contacts or give away private information?
Yes, I actually am. Yeah, it is listed in the terms and conditions when we join Facebook that it passes on information about us to our third parties, but a lot of people don't necessarily read the terms and conditions. They don't know what exact the extent. And the terms and conditions are made as long-winded and complicated as possible. They're written using legal jargon that the ordinary individual can't always understand. So they give up reading them after about reading them after about 2 lines, and then they sign up anyway. And just like it's specified in the small print, yes. But these companies abuse their power, and in fact, Facebook already breaks EU law with the amount of private information it takes, and it just pays the fines for it rather than actually changing its ways, because it makes more revenue from ads. So as I was saying, I was just saying that it's not really worth it for businesses to be allowed to access this information, and I'll explain why now. So when Facebook gathers this wealth of information about us, we don't always know who exactly has access to it. Any company, anywhere in the world, that has associations with Facebook can know what we like and so on. We don't actually often know what these companies do with our information after they get it, and sometimes they might pass on to another third party. The ads are annoying, but they seem pretty harmless most of the time. But unfortunately, that's not always true. Some of these targeted advertisements can be used to sway the public in a whole variety of ways. I think recently we've heard enough about false information being spread around the internet. And advertisements on Facebook can sometimes only be seen by those at whom they're targeted at, like specifically. If you don't fit that demographic, you might not see them. And it means they're incredibly hard to monitor. And so these companies that access our information can create ads specifically targeted at us, and it's very hard to regulate them. They can say whatever they like and then manipulate an entire group of people. To give an example, on election day in 2010, Facebook selected 61 million Americans and divided them into 3 different groups and showed 2 of these groups some kind of message to encourage them to vote. And to the other third, no message was shown at all. Through some analysis, they found that those who saw the message to get them to go out and vote, no thank you, were significantly more likely to vote. This is, of course, a good thing, but that it's motivating people to become more politically engaged, but it also shows how easy it is to manipulate individuals. It has actually been seen in recent elections where one party will put up an advertisement containing false information about the rival party, and it's just leading to issues within our democracy. It's a huge issue, and for me, and I think for what the op is saying, that we need to keep our private information away from companies like this. So, to conclude, I'm going to reiterate my points. Social media sites, in my case, I've used Facebook. They gather personal information about their users from what they post, but also from what websites they visit online. It's then passed on to companies who use it to generate targeted advertisements. This means the public can be swayed using these ads. It leads not only just from a business perspective, but it can also be used in politics. And it's for this reason that I implore you all to oppose this motion. Thank you.
I now call upon Lizzie Manville to make the case for the proposition.
So, Madam Chair, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, on that actually, in light of the recent leap forward in gender equality by the Vice Provost and the Equality Commission, I feel that our formal opening remarks are now hopelessly sexist and outdated, and I suggest we need to instruct the Law Reform Subcommittee recently convened to come up with a gender-neutral term with which speakers can address the House. This way we can avoid hurtling towards our next inevitable sexism scandal. And I was actually joking when I wrote that bit, but after Googling, is ladies and gentlemen sexist, which I was doing when very bored in a history lecture, which in hindsight was probably a bad idea, it turns out that the Women's Media Center in the US thinks that it is. From what I could make out, their objection rested on the fact that ladies is apparently not the equivalent term to gentleman, as gentlewoman would be. I've heard that word before, it sounded a bit Victorian to me, which wasn't the best time in the fight for women's equality, but never mind. And after I'd finished rolling my eyes so hard that for a second I thought I could see my brain, I then read on to discover that men and women is also sexist. Despite using equivalent terms for both sexes, it's apparently the wrong way round. And by putting men before women, people are saying that basically they think men are more important than women. And at this point I realised that my search for a gender-neutral term of address was probably on a hiding to nothing, and the safest way to address a group of people of both sexes was probably to just wave. But back onto this actual speech, as the previous 2 paragraphs worth of notes have the square root of sod all to do with this motion, and I do actually have 3 arguments in favour of this House believes you have nothing to fear if you have nothing to hide, despite all appearances to the contrary. Firstly, that mass surveillance takes place in areas which are actually already open to the public anyway, and second, that the security theatre, as it's called, created by this, decreases the public's fear of terrorist attacks, and means daily life goes on as normal in more than it otherwise would. And finally, Mass surveillance is a great help to victims of crimes and keeps law enforcement accountable because their actions are being recorded. So, my first point is that mass CCTV surveillance doesn't actually take place in areas where people should be doing anything they wish to hide or keep private, at least in theory, but people are awful and stuff that really shouldn't be done in public does get done and as a result recorded. Public areas that are covered by CCTV are areas where one would be witnessed by lots of people that one is not familiar with in any case, and they would be witnesses to any crimes one commits. So it's a false equivalency to state that the difference is that that without electronic surveillance, people have privacy in public spaces, when that clearly is not the case. The only difference is that electronic memories are far more reliable than human ones, so that when crimes do occur in public areas, we now have far more concrete evidence to use in court than merely human testimony. And a second argument that I have in favour of this motion is that even though widespread security and surveillance, such as CCTV monitoring and airport searches, do not actually stop terrorist attacks, as we unfortunately know, they do go a long way to stopping the general public from living in fear that such an attack is imminent. This might actually not be true, but at least it convinces some people that it is. And this is called the security theatre, and I've read half a Wikipedia article on this, so I consider myself an expert. And it describes the practice of investing in measures intended to provide the feeling of improved security while doing little or nothing to actually achieve it. And whilst this initially seems like a waste of money, there are several upsides to mass surveillance which we should embrace rather than fear. So if potential victims of a terrorist attack or a crime feel more protected and safer as a result of the measures, even if that's not actually the case, what matters is the interpretation that people have of it and not the reality, that everyday life carries on in a way that is often prevented from doing so when people fear that such a terrorist or crime attack is imminent. And mass surveillance and security measures also do put off some attackers, even if they're not totally effective. They only have to appear effective in many cases in order to dissuade many more unsophisticated potential attackers, who can be scared off by obvious displays of security, such as obvious cameras or heavy police presence in public areas, and who may not even attempt to determine the actual effectiveness of such measures or attempt to find weaknesses in them. And as a final point, mass surveillance and monitoring is a great service to those who are made victims of crimes. This is not just in the case of people being attacked or robbed, etc., by other members of the public, but also in the case of crimes committed by law enforcement officials against private citizens. And when people know that they're being recorded, their behaviour is far less likely to be violent and abusive towards their fellow human beings, as Sarah touched on in her speech. Yes?
The security theatre relies on the fact that the people being surveilled know that there's no other option for them to hide their action, but end-to-end encryption and the darknet totally subverts that, so could you please answer that?
Yeah, I think the security theatre is a great idea because it means that people do feel safer, and I think in this debate what we're doing is the private citizens, their feeling of safety and their actual interpretation of how they're able to go about living their day-to-day lives is the most important thing we have to worry about. So although this does betray my very low opinion of the human race in general, people will often do this, whatever they like, so long as they believe they can get away with it. This unfortunately includes violently attacking other people and other crimes such as robbery or vandalism. Whilst widespread CCTV footage has not stopped people from committing such crimes, we at least have stronger evidence than we would otherwise when crimes are committed. In addition, it does reduce the likelihood of people in positions of power abusing their positions. Police officers wearing body cameras are aware that their behaviour and treatment of people they interact with are being recorded, so modify their behaviour appropriately in many cases. And unfortunately, in many circumstances, people cannot be trusted to police their own behaviour, so such methods are necessary if we want to ensure the safety of people who would otherwise be victimised. So, in conclusion, because mass surveillance takes place in areas already open to the public, there shouldn't be anything to hide there in any case. The security theatre created by visible security presence helps to maintain normal life and decrease the fear of terrorist attacks. And when people know that their behaviour is being filmed, they are less likely to commit crimes against their fellow human beings. I'm very proud to stand on proposition for this motion.
I now call upon Annie Philippiet to make the case for the opposition.
Arnie, since this is your first
I spoke a year ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I, like everyone else in this room, value safety and security. I don't want to die in a terrorist attack or get robbed on the way home. I agree that it is the government's job to keep its citizens safe. None of us want crimes to happen. We all want to live without fear. It is tempting to grant the government the necessary powers and resources to ensure that we are all safe. But in this day and age, that includes knowing almost everything about everyone, especially their private digital communications. Essentially, the only way to achieve this is to implement universal backdoors in every technical system out there, smartphones, laptops, servers, and so on. And I think this is a frightening and absolutely horrible idea. So first of all, there is no way to implement backdoors in technical systems that cannot be abused. It has been tried and tested for decades by some of the greatest minds in computer science and mathematics to find a way to get backdoors that are not exploitable, and they've all failed. If humans create the backdoor, other humans will always be able to exploit it. No matter how hard you make it, someone will always find a way to crack into your system and use your backdoor in ways that you don't. Yep.
Is there ever a foolproof way to stop a crime?
There's no 100% way to stop any crime. Crimes will always happen. You can reduce the number of crimes, but you can never stop crimes from happening.
So we shouldn't do any order. It's not a discussion. It just has to be a thing.
Okay. The next thing is it is also not possible to ensure that no one will be using end-to-end encryption. The skills to implement that, the theory for that, that's freely available online. If you try to suppress that, good luck with that. Even China failed. So, yeah. This also means that collecting large amounts of detailed personal data on everyone poses a gigantic security threat. We have to assume that no government or organization is ever able to fully protect this data. WikiLeaks has tons of examples of that. Governments cannot keep secrets. On a small scale, imagine what burglars or pedophiles could do if they had the location data for families or their children. This data is extremely sensitive, and keeping it private is essential for the safety of innocent people. Or think about what could happen if companies lose their trade secrets or technical knowledge through mandatory backdoors that other companies, especially from other countries, would exploit. Like, it is hard enough to keep these systems safe as it is today. If you have mandatory weak spots in there, you're doomed. And to go even further, as was mentioned before with national security, every computer in every power plant, airport, hospital, and so on, if you want to have total surveillance, would be vulnerable, which means in times of war or under attack, you have no chance at all to defend yourself.
Mobile carriers use position location to allocate mobile data. Do you believe that that infringement on privacy is wrong?
I believe you should be extremely careful with how you treat that data. For example, you should completely anonymize it. There are techniques to do that today, and you should police that extremely carefully. You should not at all try to analyze that data associated with a specific person. There's been going on a lot of research, for example, on incremental privacy to do this. The next point is governments and police forces also already have lots of ways to track down potential suspects in terrorist attacks. It was mentioned that, for example, in the London attack, they were already aware of the terrorist. I would say getting more data does not help. 99.9% of the data doesn't include any helpful information. What we need is more humans in law enforcement and better trained humans to look after the cases that are already mentioned. And to go one step further, I think we should work even work on trying to prevent people from having incentives to commit crimes in the first place. For example, how do we should ask ourselves how we keep people from being radicalized to become neo-Nazis or Islamic terrorists, and start there and not just with surveillance. But in my opinion, forcing everyone to give up their privacy has even bigger implications for civil and human rights and our democracy. Everyone expects confidentiality between them and their bank, their doctor, or their lawyer. If you decide you have nothing to hide, you're opening up all your banking information and all your entire medical history. If you fail to pay a credit card bill or your rent, this will reduce your chances of getting a loan later on. If you have medical issues or pre-existing conditions, this will decrease your chances of getting insurance. Or in a court case, you rightfully expect to have secrets that the judge doesn't see directly. So you want private communication with your lawyer or with your loved ones. And to go one step further, if you have the right to remain silent, the government completely undercuts that if it's able to see everything you ever did on your digital devices. And then on a larger scale, total government surveillance would severely undermine essential values of a free and democratic country. I firmly believe that a government that has to trust its citizens and not vice versa. A government that spies on all of its citizens regardless of suspicion does not believe in their sovereignty and basically doesn't believe in democracy. And this inversion of trust and control also opens up lots of possibilities for abuse of power. Governments could target minorities like the Gestapo did. They could attack and undermine their political opposition, think Watergate 2.0. And they could spy on journalists and news outlets to prevent them from holding the government accountable, which would severely violate freedom of the press. And all that by backdoors that you propose should be mandatory in everyone's devices. So the only two options here, if you still want to proceed with this, is to either fully trust the government and just hope that it never abuses its power ever, which has never happened in the past and will never happen again, or to add lots of exceptions. Which raises two questions. How do we make sure the government doesn't go beyond its granted power, even by accident? That happened way too often in the past already, that the government just collected more data than it should. And where do we draw the line? Is running my own blog or joining a political party enough to be exempt, as I'm then a political figure? Or what I'm arguing here basically is it's practically impossible to propose a law or any kind of motion to work with Western constitutions without undermining freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and democracy itself. So to summarize, I think it's dangerous to see privacy and security as just two opposing values. Security and living fearlessly are important, but it's never possible to achieve total security. Crimes will always happen. And universal backdoors and surveillance introduce many new and worse safety threats, while privacy and encryption very often ensure security. And large-scale government surveillance also poses a security risk to our civil rights and our democratic institutions and values. The more powerful the government gets in order to keep us safe, the more we should fear it. Thank you.
I now call upon Thomas McCartan to make the case for the proposition.
Thomas, please tell me this is your first name.
It is indeed.
Maiden's rights. If you choose to keep those rights, you cannot be offered a point of information.
I will revoke my rights. God, I wish I got as good a response the other time I lost my maidenhood. That's more like it. Ladies and gentlemen, honoured chair and committee of the College Historical Society, I am here tonight to argue that if you've nothing to fear if you have nothing to hide. Firstly, I'd like to state that in spite of the straw man argument of my opposition, I am not arguing so that ISPs can throttle connections and manipulate people for every last cent. I am, however, arguing so that privacy is secondary to the safety of citizens in a country. I strongly believe that governments and not corporations should be able to monitor. And it is a government's fundamental duty to provide security and welfare to its citizens. Though we are lucky enough to live in a country of relative safety, there are many countries that are not so fortunate and are subject to tragedies that could be avoided with improved surveillance. In terms of the risk of terrorism, there are clear benefits to employing improved surveillance, and this can be seen in the foiled bomb plots of Fountain Place in 2009 and the multiple ones in Jerusalem in 2016, all of which were foiled. You need only to think of last Friday and the horrific attack of Egypt to see why this is so important. If improved surveillance can prevent such massacres from occurring, then there can be no stronger argument in favour of the proposition. Innocent lives should not be lost so that the more privileged can have safer browsing rights. And it can be easy to overlook the duty of a government in protecting its citizens when you are a young, healthy adult in a fine university, likely with good job prospects. However, it is not just for ourselves that we should argue for this, but for the more vulnerable members of society. In the words of Mahatma Gandhi, the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. The very nature of our modern legal system is based on the employment, no thank you, of imprisonment as a punishment, as well as a chance to rehabilitate and prevent future crimes. However, this system is tragically inadequate for the suicide bomber. There is no rehabilitation, and unfortunately, the punishment only comes to the innocent, their only crime being the demographic that the perpetrator hated. It is in light of such atrocities that I state it is integral that people are willing to share some of their privacy, a small part of their lives, so that the entire lives of others can be protected. We cannot wait, no thank you, until these tragedies happen. We must act, and indeed act in the best interest of all members of society. There is further evidence for the benefits of improved surveillance. Governmental agency monitoring helped take down illegal giants such as Silk Road, a darknet market that allowed the sale of guns and hard drugs. To see the horrors that these hard drugs can cause, you need only to look at the debating standard in our neighbours to fill. Many other darknet services facilitated human trafficking, and the very nature of these services with their peer-to-peer connections mean it is extremely difficult and in some cases nearly impossible to actually catch the perpetrators. Widespread monitoring is one of the few ways that actually facilitates this, in which the internet usage of people is correlated with the use of the darknet services. And although this is crude, it is one of the few ways that actually works against these sophisticated criminals. In the words of Ross Ulbricht, the creator of Silk Road, Silk Road was supposed to be about giving people freedom. What it turned into was a convenient way for people to satisfy their drug addictions. Silk Road taught me that when you give people freedom, you don't know what they'll do with it. Those are the words of the creator of the most notorious online dark web marketplace. And those are the words of a man who came to realize without regulation and security, civilization breaks down and people suffer. These are the words of somebody who deeply regrets their decision in life. I am in support of liberty so far as it can be allowed without hampering safety. But if the price to decrease human trafficking is allowing the government to know that I wasted all my study time yesterday making fresh memes about fresh students, then I'm okay with that. And if you need further evidence of the benefits of improved monitoring, look at DARPA's MEMEX program, which is employed to successfully detect and prevent human trafficking. This program employs structured data extraction to gain vast amounts of data and uses recognized patterns to detect human traffickers. Programs like these could be used to crack down on crime, no thank you. Only the red flag citizens are analyzed by another person. It does not have to be a person looking at your data. An algorithm can provide you anonymity unless you have broken the law. In this regard, you truly have nothing to fear if you've nothing to hide. In conclusion, would you be willing to share a small part of your life if it could help prevent murders, suicide bombings, and human trafficking? Would you be willing to share a small part of your life if it could make the world a safer place? I hope in deciding your side in this debate, you'll think of those who are most vulnerable in society. It will not be easy to create and maintain a culture of dutiful monitoring, but it will almost certainly be worth it. The fact that our current security isn't perfect is no reason to abandon it. Instead, we should strive for improvement so it can best serve all members of society. Thank you.
I now call upon Casper Kirkland to make the case for the opposition.
many serious things, such as cameras, Big Brother, pieces of paper over people's laptops, cameras, hackers, Facebook, advertisement, terrorist attacks, dick pics, like. But well, what I will talk is actually something what I find quite more interesting, which is me. So, some people may know or may not, but I am recently single. So, I had been in a relationship for around a year, but yeah, well, it apparently didn't work out. So, yeah, I will confess that actually I was dumped. I was not the one who was broke up. With, like, yeah, I'm the one who broke up. But yeah, the explanation that stands behind it is technically something what we refer to as, like, you know, crazy girlfriend thing, if you get me. So well, yeah, I did take my lesson, and now I'm going to convince you that, you know, even though there's like nothing to hide, there's still like no reason to be completely transparent. I would say, like, yeah, the need for transparency was something that turned me into a stalker. So, first of all, we do get like so many options to control each other, you know, yeah, interrogate like every point of life. So, I'm going to point out the ways that, you know, I was ensuring that my boyfriend was being loyal to me. So let's start with the first one. You know, do you know like a wonderful app on your phone, you know, Find Your Friends, that actually, you know, allows you to track every step of people? So, you know, after one of the nights out when, yeah, my loved one passed out, you know, I just used his like fingerprint to unlock his phone and, you know, and turn on the location. So well, yeah, it was actually the most used app on my phone. You know, when you swipe left, you see like, you know, the apps in the order. Like that was the first one. But yeah, like since I'm single now, it's like Grindr, which is way more fun. Trust me, more interaction. Great. So then we have like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. You know, obviously, like, you know, just going for friends. Like, why did you add that person? Like, why did that person like your photo? Not cool. And also like his friends, you know, like actually friends are a wonderful source of information, you know. You can just text them, message, talk to them in person, and get like whatever you want until the time they actually block you on Facebook and, you know, try to avoid you. Like, it doesn't get that cool later on. So, you know, if I look at it now, well, I think I was like more efficient than KGB, you know, yeah, I did actually very, very well. So, so yeah, after I was dumped, you know, I kind of tried to approach it all from, you know, the different perspective, you know, like from the other part. So, like, first of all, I booked an appointment with a psychiatrist. Like, I'm on medication right now. I'm great. So, yeah. And then I realized, you know, how much anxiety I must have given to him. You know, like, kind of chasing everyone's steps was not be like so cool as we can imagine. Yeah, and then I, you know, realized how much time it costed me, you know, to chasing every single step. It's actually like a full-time job, trust me. Like, for the record, I've never found like any proof of disloyalty. Never happened. So yeah, apparently like I wasted my time, you know. So yeah, then I actually thought about like the anxiety I actually gave to myself. You know, it was actually a paranoia when I look at it right now. You know, constant fear of being cheated on, like not so cool, not so great. Oh yeah, and like his friends, like how embarrassing it must have been for him, you know, having his boyfriend, like, yeah. You know, and then I actually, you know, start to wonder, like, you know, why should we not give people, you know, trust and credit? Like, you know, why? I mean, like, you know, even if there's like, you know, something that might feel, you know, suspicious, like we've got literally no moral rights to investigate it. You know, like information is a powerful weapon, but without context is a very dangerous one. Yeah, sure.
Have you ever considered a career in the NSA?
Yeah. So, like, it's actually unjust to presume that, you know, other human being is doing something wrong, you know, without sufficient evidence. So, And also, like, you know, there's nothing that can explain, you know, disbelief in someone else's intentions or loyalty. And, you know, like, the low self-esteem and jealousy ruined my relationship and, you know, someone else's well-being. You know, stalking is bad, and you know, yeah, and if you do not trust someone, you know, you should actually first focus on yourself and, you know, ask why you would not be enough for your partner. And, you know, if you can find any reasons why, you know, it's still early enough to work on it, like, you know, talk over it. You know, and also, like, you know, what is the actual value, you know, of someone acting in a certain way, you know, just because someone is under, like, constant control? You know, literally, it's like, you know, closing someone in a cell and being happy, you know, that they're not doing anything wrong. You know, the overall effect would be exactly the same as, you know, keeping someone under constant control. So, yeah, I guess that's like... So, okay, yeah, so if, like, anyone thinks, like, you know, I'm not a completely psycho after all, don't hesitate to add me on Facebook, you know, I'm single now. So I want to thank you everyone, and I beg you to oppose.
Well, I would like to second Casper's point that stalking people is bad. I would also like to second his point that locking people in a cell is bad. Yeah, we're in agreement on that. But back to the core of the debate. I think that this is an extraordinarily serious issue. My uncle, Ralph Patrick, was on ladder 3 of the Bed-Stuy Warriors when 9/11 occurred. He wasn't in the station when the first plane hit the towers. He arrived, and he wasn't on his typical track. He spent the next several days digging up the bodies of the friends he lost. My uncle Joseph owned a jewellery store in Tower 2. He was late for work because he was playing golf. Had it not been for that fact, he wouldn't be with us today. The response that we have to this not only changes our everyday lives, but it has the capacity to give and to take life. The response that the US government put in place, and that was recommended by the 9/11 Commission report, was the US Patriot Act. It's not perfect. I disagree with a lot of what it says, but in its core principles, which was to protect people from incidents of terrorism, I think it was necessary, and I think it's important. Before I get into the details on that, I want to address, though, a few of the things that have been said by the opposition bench. So firstly, First Op said that she did not believe you had capacity for contract to give away private information. I deducted, although I might be wrong here, that you didn't believe this because giving away private information is inherently bad. Well, there's lots of things that might be bad for us, but we give away, but we allow people to have capacity to enter contracts for. For example, drinking probably isn't great for you, but no one wants to ban alcohol on that basis. I don't think we should ban Facebook because Facebook, as part of the way that it makes profits, is by selling our data. Second prop, I would just like to address one point there. I do think that position location and things like that are actually important in how companies decide to provide coverage, so I'll disagree with that. But further on to my point about security, it was mentioned by our bench that the main role of government is to protect its citizens, and that is something which I stand by. The fact is, what governments are doing when they monitor our information isn't actually any different to something which you've already agreed to give up. For example, under the Patriot Act, which is brought up quite often as an argument for stricter privacy rights. Under Section 215, the government is only allowed to demand what private companies have already collected. So, for example, Facebook or Verizon already collect data on people. So you've already given up willingly. In sovereignty of contract, you have decided that you are allowing this company to collect information on you. All the government is doing is seeing that information that is already possessed by a different entity. It's not actually going out of its way under the Patriot Act to find new information. Now, of course, as in all judicial proceedings, you can get warrants for these things, and you need to get a warrant to view any information which the government collects under such acts. And the fact is, as was mentioned, you do have other websites that provide services that do not require that data to be collected. For example, instead of using Google, you could use DuckDuckGo, which doesn't collect any data on you. You could use WhatsApp, which, although now it's beginning to have some cracks in that in recent months, traditionally it did protect data to a rather high degree. So the key question here is, we've already, due to our own personal choices and personal liberties, decided to give up some realm of our privacy. Do we allow those who are responsible for protecting us to use that information to catch the bad guys? Well, being half New Yorker, my family's from Staten Island, and we were one of the lucky ones. We didn't lose anyone that day. But my neighbours and my friends did. And I cannot come up here and say, well, actually the government can't use that information, and then go back to Staten Island and look them in the eye and say, well, you know what, even though incidents like 9/11 could have been stopped, had we implemented this earlier, we're just going to stop it now. Not because it's an infringement on liberty, but those liberties we have already decided to give up. Yes, Liam.
Your case is reliant on the idea that this will prevent some kind of terrorist attack. But given that these days terrorists can literally just drive a car off the road and kill people, which can't be prevented by this information, like what gain do you actually bring?
It's not a perfect solution. So, for example, we haven't had any attacks on the scale of 9/11. Mike Morrell, who was former head of the CIA, and when he was testifying to the Senate, made this point. We haven't had attacks on the scale of 9/11, likely due to the fact that we have this data protection. Now, of course, it's not going to stop all attacks, but large-scale attacks, there is evidence to show it stops them. Yes, this gentleman here.
Please, yes. So who watches the watchman? Who keeps the...
Of course. Yeah, so for example, another thing that's misunderstood here is that any time that the government wants to use data they've collected off private companies, they have to get a warrant to view it. Now, there has been, it's not a perfect system, I agree, and we do need more judicial review, and we need changes there. I will agree with you on that. But generally, I think that a system of allowing the government to have that data is important. Now, I will agree with you. We do need better procedures to be put in place, but that is not a fault in the argument of the proposition bench. I think that we can have safe procedures in place to ensure that civil rights aren't violated, while at the same time we can protect citizens from mass-scale terror attacks. This isn't a problem that's going to go away. I think it's very important that we continue to take these steps, and ultimately I think we owe it to all those who have lost their lives in terror to take steps to prevent this from happening again. I beg you to propose.
I now call upon Vincent Traumete to make a case for the opposition.
Sorry. So I'm not here to argue against Mihal's explanation. I'm in complete agreement with that. As someone whose family has fought in every American war since World War I know what sacrifice means. But I'm not here to argue about national security. I'm here to argue on behalf of all of y'all. Most people, we're talking about national security. We're talking about terrorism and stuff like that. That's something we can all get behind on. But what's not talked about more often is the risk that this constant surveillance has on our civil liberties. Take, for instance, the most obvious case. You look at state-sponsored surveillance of the internet in China, where they pretty much track and document people who look up or participate in online political opposition discourse. And then they go out and they find them, and they track them down, they arrest them. But that's a very simple thing that goes on in many other places other than China, like Eritrea, Saudi Arabia, you know it, you name it. But that is something that's very broad and something that really doesn't affect you and I. So let me do, well, before I do that, the whole point of this debate is if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But if you're walking down the street in Chicago, you have nothing to hide, but you have everything to fear of getting shot. If you are living in Yemen, you have nothing to fear, but you have everything to fear of getting a missile blown up on your house. And if you were Jewish in Germany in 1939, you had nothing to fear that you were Jewish, but you had everything to hide after that, after Hitler came into power. So there's definitely circumstances where when you have nothing to hide, you have everything to fear. So now is my little demonstration. And anyone who has ever even thought about running for public office, raise your hand. All right, you, ma'am, what's your name? Please stand up. Ruth, now, so Ruth, and where are you from? Dublin. Okay. Now that is the limits of all your information that is on the internet, okay? Now, as a former lobbyist and a former campaign advisor, one of the main things that we do in terms of campaigning is use social media, because social media runs off an algorithm that judges your previous practices, and basically from that it develops things that pop up on your screen that are quote-unquote your prevalence, you know, for your preferences and stuff like that. But the thing is, as we saw with our last US election, we have bad actors in the world, and they infest sometimes the internet with fake news. So Ruth, okay, I'm being fake news, okay? Fake news says that you hate Dublin, okay? That you're actually very pro-British, all right? And you do not want to repeal or whatever your opinion on that is. So then that is portrayed everywhere in social media, all across Dublin. And so people who do not know Ruth personally think, oh, this Ruth she's not really a good person at all. So their opinion without even realizing, you know, what's going on is violated. Their political civil liberties have been violated. To get away off of fake news, in the United States there's a big debate about net neutrality. Now, net neutrality is a very complicated and controversial thing because right now, web providers cannot restrict the speed of which you access certain types of websites, meaning the proposition can look at all the perverted porn they want, no time, you know? So basically, all right, now if net neutrality is abolished, okay, that means certain web providers can restrict the speed of which you access certain websites. So if Ruth was running her campaign and I wanted to, you know, either stop her campaign or, you know, rub some dirt on it, I would maybe lobby a web provider and saying, hey, maybe ticket down, you know, the speed in which people can access her campaign website, okay? So then that restricts your civil liberties and also your freedom of speech and your freedom to assemble. So these are just very simple things that, because of the constant state of surveillance and your information is out there and is easily manipulated, these things can happen. And these things can happen for a very low price. Studies have shown that in the United States, the amount of money that the Russians spent to influence the election of more than 340 million people was less than the amount of money that it would take for the United States to build 1% of an aircraft carrier. We have like over 20 of them, so like, you know, that's a lot of money. So basically, you can influence an entire election through false information, and people don't even know about it. They just walk right into it, and it's not entirely their fault, but we know what's going on, and since there's really nothing to do about it, and that we can do right now, we have everything to fear. And that itself, there will always be terrorist attacks, there will always be crime, but there might not always be democracy, and there might not always be a free way of life. And for that, I oppose.
I will now put the question to the House on the motion. This House believes you have nothing to fear if you have nothing to hide. All those in favour? Aye.